Well, thanks everybody for coming out this afternoon on this beautiful day here in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And this is the event on Nigeria's elections, democracy and disillusionment. This is an event of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies, and I'm Dan Slater, the director of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies. And we're very, very happy today to have two distinguished guests who will be speaking to us about Nigeria's elections coming up next month. We have, directly to my left, we have Omolade Adunbi, who's from here at the University of Michigan. Lade is a PhD in anthropology from Yale University, and he is now a professor in the Afroamerican and African Studies Department here at Michigan. And he's the author of the book Oil, Wealth, and Insurgency in Nigeria, which was published with Indiana University Press in 2015. And then to Lade's left is Adrienne LeBas, who has come from DC, from American University to visit, although she was formerly a professor at Michigan State University, so she knows the state well. She is the author of a lot of articles, but also of the book with Oxford University Press, From Protests to Parties, Party Building and Democratization in Africa. So we'll have both of them speak a little bit about upcoming elections, set the context for us, and I might respond a bit before we open it up for Q&A. But just to sort of set the stage a little bit, I would just sort of say that I think it's safe to say that Nigeria, considering that it's the 7th largest country in the world, it's the largest population in Sub-Saharan Africa. Given current rates of population growth, it'll be the 5th largest country in the world before too much longer. But it's not a country that we see in the news very often. And it's a country that I think, at least politically, has really fallen off the radar screen to a large degree, which, as someone who studies Indonesia, when Indonesia falls off the radar screen, that's usually a good thing, because usually when we hear stories about Indonesia, it's because something's gone dramatically wrong. So in the broad scheme of things, for an outsider such as myself, Nigeria is striking in the sense that about 20 years ago, the country was really kind of a poster child of military rule, of misrule. Some of you might remember the regime of Sani Abacha, who was sort of particularly seen as almost a cartoonish figure of misrule and abuse, who passed away in 1998. And after Sani Abacha passed away, Nigeria went through a transition to at least civilian rule, which has, at least to superficial outsider views such as my own, has sort of, again, the persistence of at least minimally democratic governance in one of the most diverse, large, and to many views difficult to govern countries in the world. And so this sort of raises the question of, well, what's really happening? And so I think that given how little we hear about Nigeria in the popular press, given what a superficial sense of it I think most of us have, that this seems to be a place where things are somewhat stable, no dramatic regime-related events in recent years, I think it's a really wonderful moment to bring a couple experts here, dig in a little bit deeper, and to talk about the democracy side, the disillusionment side, as we prepare the ground and look forward to elections in Nigeria next month. So without any further ado, I think Adrienne will speak first, and then we'll turn it over to Lade before we open things up. So thanks again for coming, and thank you both for being here.
So I think I have slides. There we go. So first of all, thanks so much to Dan for the invite. I've been sort of talking about the Nigerian elections a lot with various people in DC, but it's always interesting to be invited to talk about Nigeria as an expert, because I came to Nigeria fairly recently. I'm really a Southern and East Africa specialist. So I started working in Nigeria in 2010, and I work primarily in Lagos. But over the past 2 years, I've had an opportunity to really start doing field work in other parts of the country. And one of the things that I really wrestle with is the difference between, talking about national politics and then talking about politics at the grassroots and at the state level. So I think today, in Q&A, I can talk more about some of the work I've been doing for my current book project, which is really about the microorganization of election violence and sort of how thugs are organized and linked to parties. I'm not going to touch on that too much today. Instead, I sort of wanted to organize my comments around three sorts of big questions or big sort of topics. First, I'm going to give you a little bit of Nigeria's political history, just because I know there are some in the audience who don't know Nigeria very well, and it is a really complicated place. And then I want to talk about the electoral environment. And, I think one of the reasons, as Dan suggested, we've been thinking of Nigeria as a democratic success story recently is because in 2015, there was an electoral turnover. Very well-run election in comparison. I think just generally, if we look over the course of the past 2 elections, there's been an improving sort of trajectory in terms of electoral administration and the integrity of the election process and the amount of violence during polling. So we have this improvement in the electoral environment, but I want to flag a couple of things to be concerned about for this year. And then I want to talk a little bit about what I see as a shift away from the earlier in the Fourth Republic from 1999 until probably 2000, we could say 2011, politicians really relied on violence during campaigning. And I think that we've seen over these elections, several gubernatorial elections over the past couple of years, a real dramatic reduction in the reliance on violence as a campaign strategy and instead a shift towards vote buying and the role of money in the electoral process. And then I want to talk really briefly about rule of law and insecurity. And I see this as the major challenge, not just to democracy in Nigeria, but possibly to the continual functioning of the state. So just these are sort of the introduction slides, and I think this is why I'm going first. These are our 2 main presidential candidates. We have Muhammadu Buhari, who's been president since 2015. He was elected on an all-parties Congress ticket. He's recontesting on the APC ticket. And this was the election in which the APC kicks the PDP, the People's Democratic Party, out of power. PDP presided over the transition took power after the transition in 1999 under Olusegun Obasanjo. So the first 2 terms was under Obasanjo, and then we had a Goodluck Jonathan administration, which was also a PDP administration. Important things to point out about Buhari: past military ruler, 1983 to 1985. During that period of military rule, he was known for the war against indiscipline. And so he ran in 2015 on a security kind of platform, and particularly hitting the Jonathan administration hard on its handling of the Boko Haram insurgency. And I think that there is a segment of the Nigerian population that's been very happy with his handling of Boko Haram. Obviously, the insurgency is not over, but we have seen some dramatic improvements in security with narrow respect to Boko Haram in the northeast of the country, and particularly the reach of Boko Haram beyond the northeast. His sort of opponent is Atiku Abubakar, who's generally just referred to as Atiku. He was the vice president under Obasanjo from 1999 to 2007. He's contesting on People's Democratic Party, but it's important to point out that Atiku has a history of fluidity when it comes to his party identity. And so this is sort of one of the things that I wanted to sort of just emphasize when I'm talking about Nigerian political history. We have this system in the past that has been about sort of factional reconfigurations with a very important role for particular regional brokers who are generally known as godfathers, who often has some control over coercive resources and certainly control over financial resources as well. And so the position of these state-level godfathers in relation to the central authority is very much an organizing principle of Nigerian politics. Atiku has sort of shifted with the winds back and forth between PDP and APC. He just recently crossed from the APC in order to become the presidential candidate of the PDP. So you should not think that he's a party loyalist just because he was vice president for 2 terms. One of the questions that I wanted to put on the table, and I don't know if Lade has some thoughts about this, is the question of whether we're seeing Nigeria head towards a sort of consolidating 2-party system, where we have the PDP. It's sort of a consolidated party. It has a party brand. It is known. And then we've had, since 1999, a whole bunch of opposition parties sort of splitting apart, reconstituting themselves into different coalitions. And I think one of the questions that we'll be able to know more about in the aftermath of the election is whether the APC will actually be able to create a cohesive party identity that maybe will then serve as a counterweight to the PDP in future elections. So that's sort of one question I wanted to pose. In order to understand how this sort of godfatherism and all of the rest plays out, it's very important to point out that the major organizing principle in terms of voting patterns in presidential elections is region. And I should point this out. You'll notice both of these men are wearing the same hats, that if you know Nigerian politics, you probably remember Obasanjo, who had the floppy hat. These are northern hats. And essentially what has happened is at the presidential level, we now have a regional zoning system in which the parties have this sort of gentleman's agreement that the presidency will now rotate between the regions. And so this is Atiku's last chance as a northerner to contest the presidency, which is part of the reason he left the APC. He'll probably be too old by the next time it comes around. That relates to these regional voting patterns. So PDP, both in 2011 and in 2015, has had its stronghold in the southeast of the country, which is also one of the major geopolitical zones, mostly associated with Delta tribes and Igbos, whereas the southwest of the country has sort of been the kingmaker in these two elections, where the southwest defects from the PDP, this is the Yoruba zone, and joins the APC, and that's how you get the sort of turnover in 2015, very, very simplistically. There's been a lot of movement around, but it seems for right now as if, and Lade can disagree with me, that coalition will hold, and I would project that Buhari is going to hold on, but we'll see what happens. So let me just now sort of move quickly to these kinds of questions that I wanted to talk about, the electoral environment, voting and violence, and then rule of law. So as I mentioned, one big question to keep in the back of your mind, maybe for conversation, is are we looking at a sort of emerging two-party system and some kind of constraint on partisan fluidity? I think the second big question, and this is, I mean, a broader question that goes beyond Nigeria, can you build state capacity and can you build rule of law in a democratic system with very weak state capacity? Or is it possible that democratic competition is really bad for the rule of law? And I think that's my real concern when I look at Nigeria. So very quickly, let me talk about electoral environment and just sort of current politics. So one of the important things to know about these elections is like the 2015 elections, they're going to be governed by a set of electoral reforms that were put in place before 2015 that make some of the worst elements of Nigerian political campaigning harder to organize. And so this was the sort of centerpiece of these election reforms that were put in place before 2015 was the introduction of a biometric permanent voting card, which at the polling station, this is scanned. It's confirmed with a thumbprint. It also brings up a photo of the voter. And so all of this makes ballot stuffing and a lot of the other classic sort of violent forms of party contestation harder, not impossible. And this was really intended to be a constraint on ballot stuffing, double voting, and ballot stuffing and double voting were one of the main reasons that you would have these thugs deployed to sort of disrupt polling stations and all of the rest. And in 2015, there were some problems with administration. There were accusations of disenfranchisement of voters who didn't have their PVCs or PVCs were not read properly. But generally, the administration of the 2015 vote was quite good on this front. The problem that we're facing this year, and it's not necessarily a new problem, is INEC has some challenges. Challenge number one is it only received its budget, its actual disbursement of funds for the conduct of the election in early December. And there is a real question about whether they're even going to get the voting materials in time. And yes, this is a month away. And we don't have a good sense of whether they're going to be able to pull this off for February 16th, 14th, 16th? 16th, election day. Now, it seems strange that we wouldn't know this in advance, but there's a history in Nigeria of not knowing when elections are going to take place. So last round, 2015, the 6-week delay to the election timetable was announced the Sunday before the elections. In 2011, a delay to the holding of the elections was actually announced on the day of the election. So, I think that, when you talk to people who are based in Abuja, there is a sense that these elections will be delayed. Obviously, this creates a lot of uncertainty in voters' minds. It could have some effect on voter turnout, and there are always accusations swirling about these delays are sort of strategic in order to benefit the incumbent. The second real concern with INEC is its technical capacity and its resources being stretched very thin, but also some real challenges and I think erosion of popular faith in INEC. So in 2015, the chairman was considered a technocrat, considered very sort of above politics. This time the chairman is a northerner. It's the first time that I believe INEC has had a chairman who's from the same region as the president. Second time. But it's generally created a lot of outrage. The second thing that's created outrage over the staffing of INEC is there is a sort of niece, a distant relation by marriage of the sitting president who is a commissioner on INEC as well. So in the South, and particularly in the Southeast, all of this is being used to sort of say, to cast doubt on the integrity of these elections beforehand. So that is sort of some of the challenges that we have in terms of management. I think INEC still has a lot of capacity that was built up in front of 2015, and I think that the PVC and the sort of improvements in election management will probably be maintained. I think the real worrying sign I see are these attacks on the integrity of INEC, because we can think back to 2011 in which there was very strong sort of protests and violence in the aftermath of the election and protest against the vote results. And I think that that is something that we would maybe want to watch out for this year as well. So second thing I wanted to talk about, the shift between violence and vote buying. And I think one of the first things that is really important for observers to know when you walk into Nigerian politics is the overwhelming role of money in Nigerian politics. And to give you some sense of the incentives that create this kind of vote buying system and all of the rest, total compensation for senators in Nigeria, it's not publicly published, but along with their allowances that were leaked recently by one of the Kaduna senators, they're earning 14 million naira a month. Now, what that translates into is $480,000 a year for each senator. And they have to staff their offices and all of the rest from that, but I mean, they don't necessarily have large staffs and aren't necessarily paying large salaries. So I mean, this is a tremendous sort of financial reward. And what ends up happening is you have a lot of borrowing and deployment or mobilization of resources in order to run your campaign. Part of the need to mobilize all that resources is the amount of money that it takes you to get the party nomination. So I can't really convey all of the costs of getting the nomination before you even go to general elections, but I think that the costs of the nomination forms to compete in the party primaries for president are probably suggestive. So in order to register as a candidate in the PDP presidential primary race, it's $133,000 US. For the APC, it's $33,000 US. That's just to register your name as a presidential candidate for the party nomination. And that goes all the way down to local government councilors. So there's a fantastic memoir that's available on Kindle in the United States by a Nigerian civil activist named Aisha Osori, O-S-O-R-I. Even I did not have a sense of the role of money and the actual cost of just getting a nomination until I read her memoir, in which she names names, names amounts, all of the rest. And she was just contesting for a local government seat in Abuja. So this money then creates all of these stakes in terms of mobilizing resources during general campaigns. And in the past, I think these campaigns relied very heavily on paying thugs and sort of using thugs. Now that the PVC and the biometrics make that a much less productive strategy, there's been a shift towards vote buying. And unfortunately, I don't have my notes with me on, I did some field work over the course of 2017 mostly, but also 2018, and several of the gubernatorial elections. But the amounts that individual voters are now being paid are several magnitudes more than they were in 2015. So we're seeing the individual cost of votes going up, meaning the overall cost of the campaign is increasing along with these election management sort of improvements. So, on the one hand, improvement in election integrity and electoral management. On the other hand, increasing incentives for elected officials to try to recoup the cost of their campaigns. So that's sort of what I have to say about, let me see what my next slide is. Yeah. So that's what I wanted to mention about challenges of elections and campaigns. Let me close with insecurity, as I see as a real threat to Nigerian democracy, and I would say a continuing threat to the cohesion of the state overall. So we have a tiered sort of insecurity challenge. So you basically have Boko Haram, for those of you who are paying attention, up here in the northeast, right? And there are still challenges, mostly up here. Their reach is not as far as it used to be. These states that are in green are a new challenge that I think is surprisingly not covered in the international press, given the scale of this. And this is what is known as the herder issue. Partly because of climate change, partly because there is a northerner in control of the presidency. We have a large number of Fulani herdsmen who have been moving south to pasture their cows. And the scale of this problem is intense. Estimated 3,000 people dead in these herder-farmer clashes over the past 2 years. The green states are the ones most affected. It's basically the middle belt. The reason this is dangerous is because your Fulani herdsmen are Muslim, your farmers tend to be Christian. A lot of politicians are picking up on that Christian-Muslim cleavage and using this as a wedge issue. And this is one of these existential threats to Nigeria, is Christian versus Muslim, North versus South, and it's playing out in the herders. I also want to mention another emerging security challenge, which is mostly here in Zamfara and Kaduna here, which also has herder problems. And this is serious hardcore armed banditry, where we have incredibly well-armed, possibly coming from Niger, possibly coming from other places, armed bandits who are staking out on the roads. Now it is incredibly dangerous to travel between Abuja and Kaduna because there are bandits that just stop people on the road. There's increasing evidence that these bandits are bankrolled and possibly armed by major political figures. So these are security challenges. I wanted to point out the problem for Nigerians. So, I mean, you have this Islamist insurgency, Boko Haram, you have these herders and these armed bandits, and then below that you have general crime and insecurity at the local level. So this is an Afrobarometer from 2017. Pay attention to the dark red. Those are the percentage of people who said that they themselves had experienced political violence in the last 2 years. And I think this probably understates it because they tend to undersample in urban areas. For me, I work in Lagos. It's appalling to me, the general insecurity and just the role that this plays in disillusionment, checking out of democracy, a feeling of government lack of response. And there's been very little movement on the part of the government to deal effectively either with the herder issue, the banditry issue, or the general insecurity issue. In Q&A, I'm out of time. In Q&A, I can talk more about the sort of security structure and how coup-proofing choices made by the central authority have basically created this policing problem at the state level that has resulted in general insecurity. One of my thinking on this is that a lot of this insecurity problem has been getting worse under democracy, and I can talk a little bit about the reasons why that's the case. Okay, thanks so much.
All right, thanks, Dan, for putting this together. And thanks to the Wise Emerging Democracy Center for organizing this during electoral, during the process of electioneering campaign in Nigeria, which is currently going on. And my remarks are just going to be basically about what I consider to be the important issues that will shape Nigeria's coming election. So I don't want to go back to the history of electoral practice in Nigeria, which Adrienne already talked about. But of course, towards the end of my talk, I'll respond to some of the questions and issues that she raised. So my contention is that, post-independence electoral practices in Nigeria have always been contentious. And the first post-independence election was the highly contentious 1964 general election. And since then, most elections have always been adjudged as not being free or fair. And this year's election is not going to be any way different. So the only election that was nationally and internationally adjudged or acknowledged as free and fair was the 1993 presidential election, which was won by the late businessman, Chief MKO Abiola. So the election was later annulled and the winner put in jail, where he died in July 1998. And his death actually fast-forwarded the process of transition from military dictatorship to civilian rule, which happened in May 1999. So the February 2019 election is expected to be contested by over 70 political parties. So Adrienne just mentioned that 2 of the candidates, but there are over 70 of them, I think about 73 or 75 presidential candidates, but those are the 2 major candidates. Of course, all these elections, just like the ones in the immediate post-independence era, I'll take that back. So the expected, the election in February 2019 is expected to be contested by over 70 political parties, and this will mark the 5th time presidential election will be conducted since 1999, and the 4th time by a civilian administration in this 4th republic. Of course, all these elections, just like the ones in the immediate post-independence era, were all contentious, as I said earlier on. But there are 5 factors that I think are important and that will shape the outcome of the February election. But before I go into these 5 factors, just to talk a little bit about whether there are actually political parties in Nigeria or whether what we have are political associations. And I've always struggled with this notion of whether political parties exist. But recently I've come to the conclusion that actually I don't think there are political parties, so-called, in Nigeria. And my reason is that none of the political parties are ideologically based, which is what makes fluidity and moving around of political parties easy for many of the elites who sometimes, when they lose the primary election in one political party, they easily move to the next party and claim the ticket of that political party. And that is because they are not, there is no ideology that says that, okay, this is what this political party will do if they come to power, and this is how they are going to implement their agenda. So every Nigerian elite sees political organizing as a way to get into power and not necessarily as a process of delivering services to the Nigerian people. So then, what are these 5 factors that I think will shape the coming election? So the first is that elite coalition will determine the outcome of the election. And what do I mean by this? Of course, elite coalition cut across all the ethnic groups in the country. There are over 250 ethnic groups, and each of these ethnic groups will have their own elite. So in recent political history of Nigeria, beginning with the transition to democracy in 1999, the ability of the elite to cut deals among themselves has always determined who wins and who loses during the election. And this specific pattern, which is the second point that I'm making. So this specific pattern of elite coalition and the change in voting behavior of Nigerians is relatively new. In the past, coalition of elites and leaders of traditional institutions in the country always determine electoral outcome. And what do I mean by this? Usually, post-independence era from 1960 up till when the military took power. So each regional elite will work with the traditional institution to negotiate deals of who wins and who loses. But with the military coming to power and eroding the power of the traditional institutions. So now the power of the traditional institutions have been taken over by the elite, who, rather than revert back to traditional institutions that would negotiate deals and get votes in blocks for these political parties, so it is now the elite that gets the vote by themselves without recourse to the traditional institutions. Then the third point, can we go back to the map, please?
Oh, I put the voting maps up.
Oh, okay. So the third point that I want to make is that this coming election, the battleground will be two regions, the Southwest and the Middle Belt. So the Southwest, which is this region, and the Middle Belt, the whole of this area will determine the outcome of the election. And during Q&A, I can explain what I mean by this. So, but more importantly, I think there is a silver lining in the process of democratization in Nigeria. And what do I mean by this? Many may argue that votes do not necessarily count, as it has been the case in recent elections. But in this circle, there is something that is actually going on that a lot of people are not paying attention to. And that is the idea of actually canvassing for votes in the most unlikely places. For example, organizing door-to-door canvassing. So to me, this is a good sign. And why is this the case? So this area that I said is going to be the battleground, so in recent weeks, the vice president, who is also from this area, and members of his political parties have actually been organizing and moving from door to door to canvass for votes. So to me, this is a good sign that democracy will work in the country. Then, to me, if this trend continues, in future elections, elite negotiations for power may still matter, but just as the role of traditional institutions is waning, we can also see the same happen to elite negotiations in a way that transfer power to those who actually vote, rather than elites getting into a room and cutting deals of how they want to distribute the votes of each regions of the country. So are there challenges that we'll be confronted with in these coming elections? Of course, there are a lot of challenges. Some of these challenges Adrienne already mentioned. But the first is social media. So will social media be a factor? Of course, it's going to be a factor, particularly in this era of fake news and fabrication of news. So a lot of fake news has been circulating on social media recently, and many of these media platforms are being used by some of the elite who are trying to negotiate these deals to promote their candidates. So social media will be a factor. But of course, in social media being a factor, that doesn't necessarily mean that many Nigerians are going to see what goes on social media and base their own decision to vote on that. But what is going on social media are just one of the ways in which the elite are trying to insert themselves into the negotiation process for who wins and who loses. The second challenge is, will violence be a possibility? Of course, since independence, there has never been any election in Nigeria where violence didn't occur. So we're going to expect violence to actually happen again during this electoral process. But will that derail the process of electing a new president? I don't necessarily think so. So I think there will be violence, but at the end of the day, results will be announced, and the results will be contested. Whether it is the current president that wins, the opposing parties will contest that result and say, oh, it was rigged. And if the president loses, then he's going to contest the result and say, oh, it didn't follow due process. But that doesn't mean that is going to be the end of democracy in Nigeria. Then what about money? Of course, the role of money is important, just like Adrienne mentioned earlier on. A lot of money is often used during electoral process in Nigeria. And the most recent was the case of a small state here where a gubernatorial election took place, and the two major candidates engaged in what many say was vote buying. But of course, when we say vote buying, that these politicians are buying votes and people are getting money from them and voting for them. So that takes away the agency of those who are participating in this process. So a lot of people do take money from politicians. But when we say they take money from politicians and vote for politicians because they took money from them, so we don't grant them the agency that they have, that look, they are also right-thinking humans who knows what they are doing. So if we dig deeper, we know that one of the reasons why a lot of voters will collect money from politicians is, one, because they see politicians as just going into the place to steal money. So the argument oftentimes will be, if they are going there to steal money, so why don't I get what I can get from them now? Then I vote the way I want to vote. So if they win or lose, whichever one wins or loses, the outcome is going to be the same for me. And what about herders? So like Adrienne mentioned earlier on, there has been farmers, herders clashes around this area, the Middle Belt, mostly in Benue and most recently Kaduna. But sometimes these are termed Fulani herders, or Fulani herders and southern farmers. But I don't want to see it that way. I think if we say Fulani herders, we're just reducing everything to this ethnic configuration that, oh, it is the Fulanis in the northwest. Fulanis are mostly from this region and some parts of this region, and the Fulanis versus the rest of the country. So that takes away some of the most important factors that are responsible for why these clashes do take place, one of which is climate change, for example. Lake Chad, which is around here, has been drying up. And because Lake Chad is drying up, a lot of farmers, a lot of herders, and a lot of fishermen are not able to practice their trade in this area. Then the second point is the Boko Haram insurgency that is taking place here. So since these guys who are farmers and herders are not able to practice their trade, and they are also being confronted by these insurgents, so they are left at the mercy of either being recruited into the insurgency or becoming victims of the insurgency. Then the second point is that, the insurgents who are being driven away by the state from Borno and Yobe and other states here, I mean, when I say by the state, I mean the military. So when they leave here, then they become something else when they travel to the rest of the country. And when they attack farmers and innocent Nigerians, so the press will oftentimes say that, oh, these are herders, Fulani herders. But the point again to be made is that Fulani herders are just pastoralists. So I haven't seen any pastoralists that will go around with AK-47 trying to kill people because they are trying to feed their animals. So that simplifies the whole thing about insurgency and the whole thing about the clashes between farmers and herders in many of these areas. So just to round up, why do I think this area will be the battleground? And this will also be the battleground. So there are a few elites around the Southwest. The Southwest is mostly dominated by Yoruba-speaking people. So they have come to some of the elites have come to the conclusion that if power is going to shift to the South in 2023, then that they might as well stick with the current president who has a vice president from their region. So if they stick with him, which means by the time he finishes his term in 2023, then power can come back to the Southwest. So that is the negotiation that they are currently engaging in. And if they can deliver the voting bloc of this region to the president, who is most likely going to win in the Northwest and win in some parts of the Northeast, then he becomes the president. Then the second point is that this region, particularly these two states, Kwara and Kogi, for many years were dominated by an elite group led by the current Senate president's father, and he inherited what his father built. But now, other elites who are not benefiting from that power, from that negotiation, are beginning to turn against him. So they are beginning to turn against him and mobilizing the grassroots against the current Senate president. And the idea is if they succeed in that mobilization and they deliver the votes to the current president, then he wins. Then the third factor, why I don't think the Southeast, which is mostly here, and the South-South, which is the Niger Delta, will not be the battleground. The battleground is the fact that the voting pattern of these two regions has always followed the same pattern. So, and that is not going to change in any significant way. But from what I understand, a lot of those elites in the region are also beginning to negotiate with the current president, which is why, for those who have been following election in Nigeria in the last few weeks, there seems to be no one campaigning seriously. And why is that the case? So there are two factors. One is that all the elites, they have coalesced and they have come together to say that, okay, we're just going to maintain the status quo. And when it comes to 2023, we can begin to play a new form of politics and take power. Then the second point is that the presidential election comes first, which is February 16th, and the gubernatorial election is in March. So if the governors who are running for re-election are not careful, so they fear that if the president loses, it may turn the machine against them, and they lose power that way. And none of them wants to lose power. Then the other factor is that the oil-rich rivers, Bayelsa and Delta, they are also playing their own politics, which is that they didn't seriously buy into the campaign of this guy. And why is that the case? During the primary election, they had their candidate who campaigned vigorously. The candidate is from the same region as the current president. So he campaigned vigorously. They campaigned for him. Then last minute, the night before the election, this guy who has been around for several years just came to the convention, then bought votes with $5,000 for each delegate, and he was able to win about 900 and something delegates out of the 1,200 delegates that they needed to win the presidential ticket. So he won the ticket, and they all turned against him. They said, okay, well, we're just going to play along as if we support this process, but at the same time, they are not wholeheartedly into the politicking that is going on. So one is that their candidate lost. Then the second is that they also fear that if they waste the resources, if they spend their state's resources to get this guy elected, then this guy may turn against them because of his anti-corruption campaign, and that he may just squeeze the hell out of them before the next election, which will be March, where they will be re-elected as governors. So those are some of the factors that is playing itself out as we approach February 2016 and, of course, March 2016. So I'll end there so that we can have time for questions. Thank you.
Okay. So thanks so much to both Adrienne and to Omolade for those fantastic comments. A lot to chew on. Before I offer any comments and open it up to the audience, I just wanted to give Adrienne a chance. If there was, I know there was a lot you were reacting to as Lade was speaking. Is there anything that you wanted to respond to before we kind of open things up? There's things thought you're having?
I mean, I just think that it is interesting, this election timing thing. You know, there is something about the fact that it's not a harmonized election. And actually, one of the reasons that the budget on INEC was delayed all the way to December is because there was this confrontation between the president and the National Assembly over other electoral reforms. And one of the major reforms that Parliament really wanted on the table was a reversal of the election timing so that the governors would go first, which then reverses the entire balance of power between those two branches of government. And earlier this week, I was having a conversation with one of the civil society, well, actually, IRI head in Abuja, and he was saying, you know, that this is, we were sort of trying to puzzle over whether this is a kind of counterbalancing against an incredibly powerful executive president. And, you know, we know that African presidencies tend to be too strong. So, you know, is there any way that we can sort of think about this kind of confrontation between the National Assembly and the president as maybe the beginnings of something that looks like a democratic check? I was skeptical about that argument because the governors and the senators and all of these people who want the reversal of the election timing, it's an entirely politically self-serving move, right? So I don't know, but I do think that it's this timing and the delay between the presidential and the gubernatorial elections is a massive sort of factor in how this elite bargaining plays out.
That actually kind of feeds a little bit into one of the questions I had when listening to, particularly to Adrienne's remarks about the election commission. And I was wondering if we could maybe try to bring the issue of civil society and the role civil society is playing during the campaign and in the functioning of Nigerian democracy, Nigerian politics more generally. Because, I mean, another fact about Nigeria of interest is that, I mean, unlike a lot of places in Sub-Saharan Africa, there was a successful campaign to impose term limits on the presidency, right? And so, as against kind of the backdrop here, and then as you're mentioning, there's this sense in which the integrity of elections appears to be improving. A sense that in 2015, you know, in the election commission in particular, we know from around the world that where the election commission is really respected and is seen as a neutral party, it plays an enormous role in how elections can either be respected or not. And so I was sort of curious about on the one hand, as you were saying, there's this warning signs that they're increasing attacks on the election commission, or this sense that it might be losing its neutrality, its technocratic role, might be getting more politicized. And on the one hand, of course, attacks on an election commission are bad news. On the other hand, if there's outrage over attacks on the election commission, or if there's some sense that someone's trying to defend the integrity of the election commission, that could be a good sign. And so one thing I'm wondering, if we think both about the election commission and historically this idea that, you know, we had this imposition of term limits on the presidency, to what degree is this something that is being bolstered by civil society? I mean, is there some kind of activism for democracy that takes place, or is it really just the case that the checks come from other politicians? And that essentially there's a political class which, because they want to be able to win, they want to be able to compete, that's really where the source of either outrage about attacks on the election commission are coming from, or where to the extent we have checks on the presidency, that those have come from. So can we talk about the role of, is there a role of civil society here that didn't come out so much in the presentations, but that we could possibly talk more about?
Thank you very much for that question. I'll say, you know, relatively speaking, there is a strong civil society in Nigeria, and they've played an important role since the transition to democracy in 1999. And in fact, the first electoral reform that was drafted and passed into law in 2004 was basically something that a lot of civil society organizations wrote and pushed the National Assembly to pass into law, and eventually got the president to sign into law. And since then, even the use of biometrics was an initiative of a lot of civil society organizations in Nigeria. And the idea is that if there is biometrics, that might reduce the possibility of having stuffed ballots during election, and votes can actually count. So in terms of the role that the civil society organizations have been playing, I would say, well, relatively speaking, they've been strong. And even the recent push for a new electoral reform based on some of the pitfalls of the 2015 election, was something that was pushed by a lot of the civil society organizations. And unfortunately, the reason why it didn't become law was because the president refused to sign it. And just like Adrienne said, you know, one of the reasons the president advanced was that, well, there is just about a month or two to the election. You can change the rule when election is just two months away. That I'll be happy to sign a new electoral law if it is going to take effect after the election. And of course, you know, the interest of a lot of the politicians, particularly the governors, is that they wanted to be able to shape who becomes the president, because they believe that if their election comes first, then presidential election, they can determine who will win. But of course, the elite who surrounds the president understands the game too. So they say, well, Mr. President, if you do it that way, it's like signing your death warrant. You're going to lose the election, because they will just organize against you, coalesce against you, and throw you out of office. So he realized that, and he said, okay, I am not signing. So except they agree that presidential election will come first, and gubernatorial will come second.
So, I mean, I think what I would add, you know, I agree with everything that Lade has said, and, you know, we certainly have a very well-developed civil society, not just in Abuja and not just mobilizing around these issues of sort of national policy and legislation, but also at the grassroots level. And so, you know, there's thick-on-the-ground organizations. You know, I work mostly in Lagos, and I think there's some really inspiring organizations that are trying to build accountability from the grassroots up. And, you know, I think all of that is true. I also think that it does need to be pointed out that the current administration has taken some heavy-handed and repressive steps against civil society. So the NGO bill was passed 2 years ago? A year and a half ago?
They fought against it.
Yeah, they fought against it heavily, but I mean, it did sort of restrict space and increase government regulation of civil society groups. And it was seen as a major defeat by Nigerian civil society. More recently, there have been attacks against Amnesty International by the security forces, and also they raided the Daily Trust, a newspaper, an independent newspaper offices. You know, I think that the climate and the sort of mood of civil society is better now than it was a year and a half ago. I think a year and a half ago, there was really grave concern on the part of many of the Abuja-based civil society organizations that are, you know, really involved in electoral monitoring and all the rest, that security forces were going to be used in a very heavy-handed and partisan fashion by the current president. And I think that those fears were reinforced by military deployment to the southeast during the Anambra gubernatorial election a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, in which there was this very brutal military repression of a separatist movement called IPOB. So, I mean, there were these very worrying trends, and I think there has been a softening of those concerns. I don't know if it's a change of heart on the part of the administration or exactly what Lade is pointing out. The administration doesn't fear, you know, it doesn't feel like it's vulnerable, and so there isn't a need to attack civil society to the same extent. So, sorry, pessimist response.
Great. Well, if we have about a half hour left, so if anybody in the audience would like to chime in, we'd love to have some questions from the crowd.
I'm Peter Carroll from the Political Science Department. So Adrienne mentioned this question about whether there's like a two-party consolidation. Ade, you mentioned that the framework of political parties might not be relevant for this case. I wonder if you can help us reconcile these two differences. I'd love to, hear those thoughts. Thanks.
So yeah, I could have taken issue with this. I think generally I agree with a lot of what Lade is saying about the lack of parties as parties in Nigeria. But I will say, you know, I think there's a slight difference when you get to the southeast. And obviously when you get to Lagos, right? So, you know, you have in the southeast this historical party called Action Congress, and it's sort of moved in different forms and renamed itself a couple of times. But I think there is sort of the roots of that. And certainly when we talk about Lagos, ACN was a party and was a sort of opposition stronghold at the state level for, I mean, all the way until 2015, when it crossed to ACN and actually went into coalition with the current president. And so, you know, I think when you look at Lagos, there is a party that has grassroots structures and all of the rest and, you know, behaves like a party. But it's certainly true that outside of Lagos, you know, that falls away really quickly. Now, in terms of, you know, like the question that I posed about a two-party system sort of emerging, it does seem, and I think this has a lot to do with the constitutional provisions that require sort of vote distributions in order to gain power. And I think it also has a lot to do with the zonal rotation at the presidency, but also at the state level, there's a requirement for zonal rotation in terms of governors as well. All of that, I think, creates constraints on the amount of fluidity. And so for me, my sort of reference point is always Kenya, in which there are new parties every single time. The party labels have no meaning to voters. It really just destroys any possibility of voter accountability. Whereas I do wonder when I look at politics in Nigeria whether we might be seeing the emergence of something that is like not a programmatic cleavage, but might look like the sort of very, very beginnings of the evolution of something. So I think certainly when I look at the ACN and the role that the Lagos sort of cartel played in the formation of ACN APC, and the operation of APC over this first term, Lagos is known to be one of these reformist states that has this kind of technocratic kind of bent. And we have a number of APC governors who are very much of this technocratic sort of building state capacity, increasing reliance on internally generated revenue, doing a lot of really fancy technocratic reforms that donors like. And that does seem to be an APC thing. Whereas PDP, I mean, for better or worse, does seem to be tarred with more of this patrimonial kind of brush. And I wonder whether that kind of thing over time could possibly turn into something that looks like a party brand. You know, where the APC is going to say, hey, we're running on technocratic reform, and yeah, we're a little bit authoritarian, but you're gonna like it. Whereas PDP is like, and they attack PDP for being corrupt, and PDP instead says, hey, we listen to the people. I mean, it begins to look like a party brand a little bit. So I don't know. I mean, they could all blow up and reconstitute themselves after the elections, which I think is Lade's expectation.
Yeah, but you know, that is, can everyone hear me? So that is my expectation.
For recording.
Oh, okay. So the reason why I said there are no political parties in Nigeria is basically because, you know, parties are defined by what they stand for. So not who are members of those political parties. But in the case of Nigeria, you can't say this is what APC stands for or this is what PDP stands for. But of course, out of the over 73 political parties, there are some that are ideologically leaning, like the Socialist Party of Nigeria or the Democratic Alternative. Well, those ones will claim that, oh, we are socialist and that is what we stand for. But for the major political parties, so in terms of their programs, you can't see any difference, which is what makes it fluid for people, for individuals to move in between parties. Once they lose the ticket of one political party, they can go to the other and claim membership there. And sometimes they just go there and buy the ticket. And when they win election, after a year of being in power, they can return to their old political party. So, for example, Abubakar Atiku started as a member of the PDP, but he's been in close to about 3 or 4 political parties in the last 16 years in his attempt at becoming president. So this is his 3rd attempt at running for president. So when you see an individual like that, so if he becomes president today, his program is not going to be in any way different from what the current APC government is implementing. So that is my own notion of what political parties should be. It has to be about the program of that party, not the individuals that are there. So the fluidity of moving around is it's what I think makes it more like an association of friends rather than political parties. But of course, for the Southwest, you might say that is a little different. And why is that so? So the bulk of those who fought against the military, if I'm not exaggerating, the bulk of those who fought against the military during the era of military rule from 1983 to 1999, when they eventually left power, were from the southwest of the country. And of course, there are a lot of those who also participated from the southeast and south-south and the northern part of the country. But when political parties were being formed in 1999, so a lot of those elites from the southwest went back to some of the cleavages of political association of the 1960s, post-independence 1960s, and they actually claim that ideology, which is in the southwest, they call it the Afenifere. So they refer to themselves as Afenifere, that is, we want good things for ourselves and we also want good things for everyone. So on that platform, they formed what they call the Alliance for Democracy. And they make the claim that they were going to bring back memories of political organizing of the 60s, which was what won the election for them in 1999. But by 2003, the president, Olusegun Obasanjo, that Adrienne mentioned earlier on, who is from the southwest, but never got the vote of any state in the southwest when he ran for president, consolidated power and threw virtually all of the governors out of power with the exception of Lagos. So Lagos just...
Big bags of money.
Yeah, because Lagos, they have a huge internally generated revenue, and it's the most viable of all the 36 states in the country. So they stood their ground, and they used that platform to, claim that ideological bent of being an opposition and a party with an ideology. And when it came to 2011 and 2015, so they used that same platform to form an alliance with the current APC. So they just merged with the APC. But my fear is that if Buhari were to lose election today, or come 2016, that's the current president, so APC will wither away and a new coalition will emerge. But of course, if you look into the future, maybe 10, 15 years to come, you might say that maybe some of these elites will be able to consolidate power in such a way that they will gravitate towards two political parties that will be the major political parties in the country. But I will still want to see a party that is ideologically driven.
And the floor crossing is amazing. The scale of floor crossing is just incredible before elections and after elections.
So I guess, so it seems like one question then is, so we could say, well, parties don't seem to be programmatic, they don't seem to be ideologically driven, they don't have different platforms. But it's certainly the case that, in a lot of parts of the world, that's true of parties. But you still have very, very intense competition. And you have very strong accountability relations to the public, to the extent that people are willing to vote for opposition, people are willing to vote politicians out when they seem to be underperforming. And it's also, so one possibility is what we might call sort of valence issues, or just sort of performance. Another possibility is more sort of clientelistic politics. And so the idea is that if people show that they're able to deliver the goods to their constituencies, and they get rewarded accordingly. And that, again, could be a kind of accountability that creeps into politics. And then really a third kind, which I think, the sort of cartoonish view of Sub-Saharan African politics, is that things become organized ethnically. And that effectively what is really at stake is which ethnic group in a particular election is going to be able to have the lion's share of power and resources. And so the one question is like whether there are cleavages arising around which competition happens, whether accountability is arising, and does one need necessarily ideological parties, programmatic parties for that to happen. But it doesn't sound as if, nothing in your comments suggests that there's some really clear correlation between support for one of these parties and certain constituencies, other than perhaps regionally speaking. So is there a sense in which we think that, and that would really be kind of where you'd get two-party or two-cleavage, two-poles politics coming from, that there's a way in which there's a consistency in support for one side or the other. So do any of those patterns speak to what we might be seeing? Are things too fluid for that to be the case? or what do we think?
I think this is where zonal rotation comes in. I mean, you know, if you have agreed that every single election cycle you're going to run the same region, it means that ethnic clientelism, I mean, there aren't incentives for that, right? Instead, you know, you get this fluid kind of, okay, well, you know, who's our Yoruba guy this election? And I think it's important to emphasize this goes all the way down to the state level. And so I think the emergence of sort of programmatic politics in states is also hurt by the fact that there's zonal rotation across the senatorial districts in the gubernatorial elections. So, you know, the cleavages that matter inside states between, you know, Christians, Muslims, Northerners, Southerners, or even, you know, poor people in one region versus, you know, wealthy business interests, all of those sort of drop away because the parties coordinate on, you know, the same constituency sort of being represented in a particular gubernatorial election. So no elites have an interest in sort of building up a reputation for representing a particular constituency because it limits their options when the rotation comes around to their particular identity group. And I mean, you know, there's this interesting thing about Nigeria where I think the Civil War was such incredible trauma that the entire federal system has been set up to make sure that that doesn't happen. But the cost of that is there is no accountability. And so, you know, you have this incredible system that's very, very resilient, but it's very hard to sort of build actual accountability relations, even if you're a governor. It's very hard to sort of build that up over time and use good performance at the state level to improve your possibility for national election. And I think that you see this with, you know, all of the technocratic governors who've made real improvements. You know, when they move to the federal level, they lose their track records.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And one thing to add to that is you know, political organizing among the elite is oftentimes determined by distribution of goods among them and not distribution of goods to the people that they serve. And that is what makes it practically impossible when a political party wins election, for example, then the other parties don't organize until the next election is getting closer or the next election is around the corner. And one of the reasons for that is that a lot of the elite, whether in the southwest, southeast, south-south, or whichever part of the country, they are highly dependent on the state for survival. So they are always, you know, attaching themselves to whichever party is in power. And the reason is that a lot of them are contractors. So if, and what contractors means that, you know, they get contracts from the state to implement a project where they make their money from. So that makes it impossible for them to organize as an independent agent outside of the state. So when they lose power, then their business goes down and the possibility of organizing politically becomes practically impossible for them, which is why once a party wins power, then all those who loses will just you know, transition to the party in power and become members of that political party. And the reason is everyone wants to be part of that distribution of goods.
You're supposed to be the optimist.
Huh?
You guys can each play both roles. That's fine. Any other questions in the audience? Sir.
Stand. Hi, my name is Alfred Mamadou. I'm a Nigerian law student. And I'm so glad that this is being organized on campus. I was really excited when I saw the flyer. Just want to push back on one thing, the talk about parties and ideologies and the fact that it would seem, as the professor said, that we have collections of friends in Nigeria and not parties. I think maybe the reason for that is because the problems of Nigeria can be solved without parties being steeped in ideologies. Insecurity doesn't need you to be conservative or liberal to be solved. Poverty can be solved Well, depending on what economic model you choose to adopt, but the point is that a lot of the issues that we have, nepotism, tribalism, all of these things that affect good governance are things that can be solved without one having to necessarily totally draw upon a particular ideology. That's that. But then also I wanted to ask a question about what young people with good ideas and with good intentions can do to win elections in Nigeria, because it would seem that we are caught in a position where I'm going to say this, we have to pick one of the lesser of two evils at this point. I personally, I'm not inclined to vote for either of the candidates, but those are the options we have. Those are the people we know are going to win. And so people are going to cast votes in February, knowing, not because they believe that the person they're going to vote for is someone who is going to properly implement the ideas, well, the aspirations of those persons, but because they know that they have to vote for someone who they think might win. And you have young people today, I don't know if you know of Bankole Wellington, the Nigerian singer who's running for office in Lagos. So Banky W, which is his stage name, Banky W is running for office. And there has been a great campaign on Instagram, a great campaign on Twitter, and it seems like it's getting a lot of traction. My fear when it comes to that is people on Twitter don't vote a lot of the time. And usually the people who vote in Nigerian elections are people at the grassroots level. So the market women, the artisans. So what do young people have to do without being sullied by the system that we have now and the corruption, the political parties that we have now? How can young people set themselves apart, but at the same time still be able to connect with the grassroots without the resources, stolen resources that a lot of the big political parties have now? Connect to the grassroots and win elections.
Yep. Thank you very much for that good question. And like Adrienne said, I'm an optimist. I'm optimistic that very soon democracy is going to take root and the youth will be able to participate in a way that will let them, when they run for office, win elections. Then the second point is, when I say political ideology, I do not necessarily mean that a party has to be a socialist or a capitalist. So I use that advisedly. And when I think about parties having political ideology, I'm thinking about the Democratic Party, for example, and the Republican Party. So you hardly see someone who runs for president on the platform of the Republican Party who loses, then goes to the Green Party to say, oh, I'm now going to be a candidate of the Green Party. So that is going to be something that you will never see happen here. So it is in that context that I use political ideology for political parties in Nigeria. Then for Bank W, who represents what you could call the new generation of politicians in Nigeria. Well, elections are never won on social media. So that is what I see there. And I'm going to use a good two examples. The first example is Atiku's opponents in the primary election in the PDP, the current Senate president, and the governor of Sokoto State, which is in the northwest of Nigeria. So prior to the primary election in PDP, everyone thought that the Senate president was going to win, because they will conduct all these online polls and it will win 70% of the poll. Then Atiku will come last. Then they will conduct another one, Tambuwa will win. And the buzz in social media was it was going to be Saraki or Tambuwa. Then a day before the election, this guy moved into the space and defeated all of them. Saraki, that was leading on social media, couldn't even get up to 100 votes. And this guy got 800 and something votes. Then the second example, Lagos State. So the current governor of Lagos State was running for a second term, but the godfather in quote, the leading elite in Lagos moved against him. And of course, the leading figure in Lagos was also protecting his own interest. Not that he necessarily wanted the current governor not to win second term in the party. But on social media, the current governor was the boss. Everyone said that he was going to win. It was going to be a slam dunk for him. Then on the primary election, the party insisted on having an open primary. And what happened? The current governor could only get about 40,000 votes. And the guy that won the primary got close to 1 million votes in Lagos. So who would have thought that that would happen? But you know what happened? Grassroots. So one of the things that they used against the current governor was that some of the projects that his predecessor, who is now a federal minister, started, he abandoned. Then secondly, it was about trash. Trash in Lagos. So trash was something that the elite had cornered, and they, for several years, for the last 16 years, had used to empower their constituents. So everyone benefits from trash. So, but this new governor came and said, oh, I am going to modernize things. So he gave the contract for trash collection to just one company, and that was his major undoing. So when the grassroots started grumbling that how could they do that? This is where we all benefit from. So they went to the Godfather that, look, if you go with him, we're going to move against you. And of course, the Godfather didn't want to lose power. What did he do? He told the governor, I am not with you, so I am with the other guy in the primary. And everyone thought that the Godfather won. But of course, the Godfather was just playing smart politics. And that was it.
Really tempted to go on this trash tangent. I mean, I would disagree with the Tinubu followed the grassroots. I don't think that the Godfather was facing a defection at the grassroots and had to back a new candidate. I think he decided to back a new candidate and the grassroots followed. And that will go to my advice. So my first book is about how you build a strong opposition party in a sort of semi-authoritarian state. And one of the arguments, and you don't need to read the book, just read the conclusion, I sort of say, you know, that trying to build a party is not the right pathway. Instead, you try to build the mobilizing structures. And your mobilizing structures are going to be more cohesive and more durable when they're not about political alliances or political mobilization. Instead, when they're around durable identities, maybe about class, maybe about some kind of economic interest, could be a farmers cooperative, could be a union, whatever it is. And that forges a sense of linked fate. And then once you have the mobilizing structure, turn it into a party or push it behind a party. And that's where you actually get power from. So, you know, to keep this in Lagos, when you talk about how Lagos godfatherism works, Tinubu, who is the godfather who's been there for quite some time now, he has, and I mean, everyone talks about them openly, shadowy networks, right? He has actual organizational resources. And we can talk about what these are. They are the marketplace associations and the umbrella group that's run by his daughter, right? They are the NURTW. They are the trash pickers who are incredibly well organized because it's Lagos, everyone is really well organized. All of that organizational capital is what you need to actually stop this kind of elite cycling and patrimonial politics and the money. The problem that you're running into in Nigeria, in Lagos and in Nigeria, is the money. So, I mean, you need to read Osori's memoir in order to know what you're up against. You're going to have to craft a kind of notion of linked faith and an identity amongst the youth and a kind of grassroots organization that makes people take the money and then vote differently. And I don't know how you do that except at the very, very local level. You do it in a single community. You take over a counselor position. You somehow keep your counselors accountable, and then you build up from there. So, I mean, afterwards we could talk more about, you know, these people I know in Isolo, which is a local government area in Lagos, who are trying to do this around local government accountability. And I truly believe that the only hope for Nigeria is not at the federal level. It's not at national politics. It's basically that you get some good quality technocratic governors, you get a whole bunch of fasholas in there, and you hope that they stay good enough for long enough that they immunize their states against godfatherism. And Fashola couldn't. He stayed for 2 terms. And I mean, I know I've drunk the Kool-Aid on him, but I saw a massive change in governance in Lagos and the beginnings of what looked like real accountability politics. And we've seen a reversal of that. So, I mean, it's got to start at the local level, and then it's got to build up to the state level. And you're not going to do it with social media. I mean, social media penetration, it's so incredibly low. And not only that, any kind of sense of identity that you build via Instagram is too weak to actually cohere in the face of vote buying and thuggery and all of the rest. Instead, what you guys need is a really good union structure. And sadly, the military dictatorship was really good, I mean, secession of them, was really good at breaking the very powerful, cohesive, organized labor structure that Nigeria had.
Correct.
Sorry.
Any other questions from the audience? Anyone else?
I have a quick question from a non-Africa expert. So you mentioned that after the military rule, there was this change at the local level when the traditional institutions kind of lost their power and authority. And I'm wondering, who are the current elites compared to the traditional institutions? So the traditional institutions were elders, community leaders, and now it's economic elites, or maybe that's a different kind of configuration? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. So what I meant by traditional institutions were the obas, the kings, the chiefs, and the elders in different communities across the country. So when political organizing started prior to independence, so politics got organized around these chiefs and kings. And that was because Nigeria came out of an indirect rule system that was put in place by the British, wherein the British ruled through the chiefs and the kings. So by the time politics of independence was setting in, a lot of the politicians knew the power that the kings and chiefs had. So up until even the Second Republic in 1983, and between 1979 and 1983, when a politician comes to town to campaign, the first port of call will be the King's Palace. Then when election is approaching, maybe on the day of election or a day before the election, the king will announce that this is where we are going. So all the subjects will, when I say subjects, all those who live in the kingdom will follow the direction of the king. But one of the things that the military did was that they realized the power of the kings and chiefs. And they basically destroyed the kings and chiefs by making them appendages of the state. So in most cases, during the military era, when a king passes on, then the military will appoint their own favorite as the king or as the chief. So by the time the politicians took power in 1999, because many of those who became politicians were also those who were either bureaucrats or appendages of the military dictators. So they had perfected this strategy of eroding the power of the kings and chiefs. So now when a king dies, then the governor will appoint whoever he thinks is someone that is close to him, whether he's the most qualified to become king or chief. So that is how that erosion of power of the kings and chiefs set in, which is why today a lot of the politicians hold economic power. So the kings are just there as figurehead. So now if you go to any community and the king says, this is where I want my people to go, they're not no one will listen to that. They will listen to a Tinubu who is the godfather of Lagos rather than the king of Lagos. And if you follow, for example, if for those who follow Lagos politics very well, when the last king died, Tinubu was instrumental in putting the new king of Lagos there.
So during the 2015 election, the King of Lagos said whoever votes against the APC, which is the party of the Godfather, that if they are not from Lagos, then on their way out of Lagos, they will probably end up dying in the lagoon or the Atlantic Ocean. So, and people questioned him, why will the king, who is supposed to be the father of all, say such a thing? And his response was, well, there is no space for any political party outside of APC in Lagos. So APC is going to rule Lagos forever. So that has never happened. In the past, it is the politicians that will go to the chiefs and kings. But now, the chiefs and kings will go to the politicians.
Yeah. I mean, but so much of this is about money as well.
Yeah.
And I mean, you know, it is really interesting. I only know like these local traditional institutions. Well, that's not true. I know them mostly in Lagos, but you know, I do know a couple of other states, and they do still have some role to play at the local level in terms of governance. And you know, I do wonder if we did do this kind of grassroots organization building kind of scenario, whether the role of Obas and Bales could be democratic enhancing. I don't think they necessarily have to be appendages, because I think in some places they still do play a role, particularly in sort of organizing the vigilante forces and other forms of community volunteerism. Yeah, it's very easily hijacked, though. I mean, everything is just very easily hijacked with money.
Okay, terrific. Well, we're just about out of time, but I just wanted to say before we part that if anyone here, so hopefully this has whetted your appetite for the study of African politics and high-level discussions of that, because our next event at WCED in 2 weeks is going to be our postdoctoral fellow, Fiona Shenbai, will be presenting her research on judicial politics in authoritarian regimes in Sub-Saharan Africa. So a little bit of a theme for the month, which hopefully will get some of you to attend for that as well. But mostly what I want to do is just thank Omolade Adunbi, thank Adrienne LeBas for, really fantastic conversation. I learned a ton. I think everybody has about a case we know way too little about. So thank you so much for the time you spent, and looking forward to further conversations. So thank you.